contracted into impossible shapes. The event horizon seemed alive, writhing, as if hungry for anything foolish enough to come near. "Emergency thrusters aren't responding," Arjun's voice cracked with panic. Elias didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the abyss. Somewhere deep within, he felt it calling, a low hum reverberating in his bones. "Professor," he snapped back to reality. Arjun was trembling, sweat pouring down his face. The rest of the crew's terrified expressions mirrored his own fear. There was no way out, not for all of them. Elias made the choice without hesitation. "Jettison the research pod," Elias commanded. "It'll buy you time." Arjun's eyes widened. "What about you?" Elias forced a grim smile. "I'm already too close. I'll guide the ship into the slipstream and figure it out." Before anyone could argue, Elias reached over and initiated the sequence. The safety pod hissed as it sealed shut around his crew. There were muffled protests, fists hammering against the glass. He watched their faces one last time, then hit the release. The pod ejected, drifting rapidly away from the gravitational well. As it cleared the ship's exterior, Elias saw Arjun's mouth form the words, "Don't do this." Then they were gone, a speck in the distance. The ship shuddered violently, pulled deeper by the invisible hand of the black hole. The lights dimmed, then failed altogether. Elias closed his eyes as the cockpit crumpled inward. There was no sensation of death, no moment of finality. Instead, time splintered. His heartbeat stuttered into strange rhythms, his body twisting under the weight of gravity itself. He should have been annihilated. Instead, he opened his eyes. He was somewhere else. The first thing he noticed was the wet, organic scent in the air, like copper and decay. The ground beneath him pulsed gently, like muscle contracting beneath skin. The sky, or what passed for it, was a murky expanse of fleshy strands latticed with bioluminescent veins. Their glow cast the landscape in a sickly, golden hue. Elias staggered to his feet, groaning as a wave of nausea overtook him. His body felt wrong, slightly elongated, as though stretched out and not quite snapped back into shape. His fingers trembled as he brushed a hand across his face, relieved to find it intact. "What? Where am I?" His voice barely escaped his throat. The ground around him writhed, a slow, undulating motion that sent chills down his spine. Towering structures, vaguely organic in form, loomed in the distance. They resembled immense fibrous pillars with veins that pulsed in rhythm with the sky. A low hum rumbled beneath his feet. It wasn't random noise, it was a pattern, a pulse of thought woven into sound. Elias took a step forward and froze. The thing watching him was impossible to miss. It stood at the edge of a nearby ridge, blending into the terrain with its translucent, membranous skin. Spines jutted from its elongated arms, vibrating slightly with each motion. It had no eyes, only two deep, hollow cavities where eyes should have been. It was unnervingly still, like a predator assessing its prey. Elias swallowed hard. Slowly, he reached for the emergency flare clipped to his belt. The creature's head tilted slightly, as though it recognized his intent. Before he could ignite the flare, the ground beneath him split open like a wound. Elias fell into a cavernous tunnel of sinew and cartilage. He slammed into the floor below, the air knocked from his lungs. The creature peered down from above, its hollow gaze tracking him without urgency. Pain shot up Elias's leg as he struggled to stand. The tunnel walls contracted, closing in. Panic surged in his chest, but then he noticed something else. A fragment of the structure glowing faintly in the dim light. It pulsed in time with the ambient hum. Elias reached out instinctively. The fragment was soft, pliable. It detached easily, folding into his palm like wet silk. The glow intensified, seeping into his skin. Suddenly, the tunnel around him convulsed violently, as if in response. The walls opened, expelling him upward in a geyser of viscous fluid. He landed hard on the ridge above, coughing and gagging. The creature was gone. No, it had moved closer. Much closer. Elias could see the intricate mesh of tendons beneath its translucent skin, its spines twitching as if tasting the air. The fragment in his hand pulsed urgently. Elias felt a strange sensation, a connection, like an echo of thought not his own. The creature froze, its spines flattening. Understanding flashed through Elias's mind. He didn't need to outrun it. He could use this. His grip tightened around the fragment, and the ridge around him began to fold inward, creating a rift in the air itself. The creature let out a low, reverberant body shattered into shards of light and sinew. When he opened his eyes, he was floating above Earth's atmosphere, the faint blue curve of the planet below him. A burning trail marked his re-entry. Then the pain hit, a deep, searing agony in his chest and limbs. His body burned as though rejecting itself. The last thing he remembered before he blacked out was a shape. Impossibly far away, but unmistakable. It was following. Elias woke in a sterile cocoon of light and noise. Machines beeped steadily around him, their soft hums grounding him in the familiar, but his body felt alien, heavy, sore, and out of sync. His vision blurred as he blinked, trying to focus on the sterile white ceiling above him. A voice broke through the haze. "Welcome back, Doctor." Karn. It was Dr. Abramson, head of the mission recovery team. His face was drawn, a mix of relief and something else. Fear. Elias groaned as he tried to sit up, pain radiating down his ribs. Abramson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Easy." Memories flooded back in sharp, jagged flashes. The black hole, the living world, the creature watching him, and the pulsing fragment he had taken. The crew, Arjun, are they? "They're safe," Abramson assured him. "Your emergency protocol saved them. You, on the other hand." He hesitated, then handed Elias a tablet displaying diagnostic readings. "When we found you, you were frozen, like a meteorite wrapped in some kind of organic casing. The heat shield didn't even scorch it. We had to peel you out of it." Elias stared at the images on the screen. His body encased in translucent tissue, veins snaking around his limbs like vines. He fought the urge to retch. "You've been under observation for 2 weeks," Abramson continued. "There's no sign of infection, no residual contamination. But He trailed off. But I'm different, Elias finished for him, feeling the truth settle like ice in his gut. Abramson nodded reluctantly. You're stable, but your blood chemistry is anomalous. Increased protein synthesis, altered cell structures. We're not sure what it means yet. Elias looked at his hands. They seemed normal, scarred from years of work, but still his. And yet, beneath the surface, something pulsed faintly, an unfamiliar rhythm just out of sync with his heartbeat. They discharged him 2 days later, but the feeling of being observed never left. Even in the safety of his apartment, the shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The world moved on around him. Interviews, headlines calling him the man who returned from the event horizon. His research notes, though fragmented, sparked a wave of breakthroughs. Laboratories across the globe replicated pieces of the strange technology he had inadvertently brought back, integrating it into power grids and communication networks. Yet for all the accolades, Elias felt hollow. At night he lay awake staring at the ceiling. The hum from the black hole world still echoed faintly in his mind. It wasn't over. He knew that in his bones. Then the changes began. It started with his reflection. In the bathroom mirror, he caught something, a flicker of movement that wasn't his own. He leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. His pupils dilated unnaturally wide before contracting again. He blinked, and the moment passed. The following day, while drinking coffee, his wrist spasmed. The mug fell, shattering on the floor. When he looked at his hand, the skin was translucent for a fraction of a second, veins glowing faintly beneath. Just stress, he whispered, clutching his arm. But deep down, he knew better. Days passed, and the episodes grew worse. His body felt foreign, as if it was shifting when he wasn't paying attention. He took to wearing long sleeves to hide the strange discolorations, spreading up his arms like cracks in glass. Then came the whispers. It happened late one night. He had been reviewing old footage from the mission when the screen glitched, briefly showing the creature's hollow eyes staring back at him. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating in his skull. A voice, a low, reverberating drone, filled his mind. We know you. Elias staggered back, clutching his head. The whisper wasn't external. It was inside him, coiled deep within his brain like a parasite. In the silence that followed, something moved in the shadows of his apartment. Elias spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty. Breathing heavily, he stumbled toward the door, flinging it open to flood the room with light. Nothing stirred, yet he felt a presence, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, he drove to the research lab in a haze of exhaustion. He found Dr. Patel, one of the lead analysts who had worked with him before the incident, and pulled her aside. Something followed me back, Elias whispered. Patel frowned. What are you talking about? Elias's hands trembled as he explained the changes, the glowing veins, the whispers, the shadow that lingered just out of sight. Patel's expression shifted from concern to fear. Elias, I've been seeing things too. He stared at her, stunned. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a patch of translucent skin crawling with thin, pulsing tendrils beneath. Elias felt the floor drop out beneath him. It wasn't just him. The fragment, the stolen technology, had done this. Is it in the systems? He asked. Patel nodded grimly. We don't know how to stop it. It's spreading, changing things. Elias left the lab in a cold sweat. Outside, the city bustled as usual, but it felt wrong. He noticed the subtle changes, electronic billboards flickering with strange fluid patterns, streetlights dimming and brightening in odd rhythms. It wasn't paranoia anymore. The thing from the black hole wasn't just following him, it was embedding itself into the world. That night he locked every door and window in his apartment, paranoia gripping him like a vice. Yet, even as he reinforced his walls with what little comfort he could find, he knew it was futile. At 3 a.m., he awoke to a soft vibration under his bed, like the low hum of a distant heart. Slowly, he leaned over the edge. There, in the shadows, a familiar pair of hollow, eyeless sockets stared back at him. It had arrived. The creature didn't move. It didn't have to. Its hollow gaze pinned Elias in place, as though it had already consumed every ounce of strength he had left. The low hum filled the room, vibrating the air like the tension in a wire pulled too tight. Elias scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. His breathing was ragged, heart hammering in his chest. For a second, the room seemed to warp, the walls bowing inward, the light fixtures pulsing in time with the hum. Then it was gone. The hum ceased. The air became still. Elias sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space beneath his bed, waiting for some sign that it hadn't been real. But the pressure in his chest, the raw terror, those were real. He wasn't losing his mind. Morning arrived in a wash of gray light. Elias packed a bag with whatever he could grab, a portable hard drive containing his notes, survival gear, and a pistol he hadn't touched in years. He didn't know where he was going yet, only that he couldn't stay. The creature wasn't bound by physical barriers, doors, walls. They meant nothing to something born of a place where time and space bent like paper. His phone buzzed, a message from Patel. Something's wrong. It's here at the lab. People are missing. Elias's blood ran cold. He called Patel, but there was no answer. He drove to the lab in silence, paranoia gnawing at him with every passing mile. The streets felt emptier than usual, as though the city itself was holding its breath. When he pulled into the parking lot, the building loomed like a mausoleum. The front doors were ajar. Inside, the lab was eerily silent. Desks were overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a slow, irregular pattern. "Patel!" Elias called out, his voice echoing. No response. He stepped deeper inside, passing through the observation room, where he and Patel had first analyzed the alien fragment. The room was dark, save for a faint, sickly glow emanating from the center table. Elias froze. Patel was there, or what was left of her. She was fused to the table, her body encased in a cocoon of translucent membrane. Veins of bioluminescent tissue spread out like roots, pulsating gently as they drained her. Her face was frozen in a rictus of terror, her eyes wide and glassy. Elias staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The hum returned, low, insistent. He turned slowly. The creature stood at the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows. Its spines quivered as it moved forward, slow and deliberate. Its hollow eye sockets radiated an ancient, insatiable hunger. Elias's instincts screamed for him to run, but he forced himself to stand his ground. The pistol trembled in his hand as he raised it. "Stay back," he whispered. The creature didn't stop. Elias pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed like thunder. The bullet struck the creature's torso, passing through its gelatinous form. It staggered, but the wound knitted itself back together in seconds, the hole closing with a wet, sickening squelch. Elias fired again, once, twice, until the clip was empty. It was useless. The creature lunged. Elias dove out of the way as its arm slashed through the air, razor-sharp spines slicing through the metal console behind him like butter. Sparks rained down as the console exploded in a shower of light. Elias sprinted down the corridor, heart pounding. The hallways twisted and warped around him. He could feel the creature behind him, its presence like a weight pressing against his mind. He burst out into the cold, open air of the parking lot and kept running. His breath formed ragged clouds in the chill as he sprinted toward his car. The hum intensified, the very ground beneath him vibrating. He reached the driver's side door, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he sped out of the lot, tires screeching. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, motionless, watching him go. But Elias knew this wasn't over. He drove aimlessly for hours, his mind racing. The creature wasn't hunting him. It was herding him, forcing him towards something. The fragment in his possession pulsed faintly in his bag, almost as if alive. Eventually, Elias realized where he had to go. There was only one place remote enough, isolated enough where he'd have a chance to stop this: the Arctic Research Station. It was an abandoned facility, built for extreme weather testing and forgotten after funding had dried up. The perfect place to lure the creature and end it. The journey north was grueling. Each day brought more signs of the creature's influence. Power outages rippled across cities as the alien energy spread through Earth's infrastructure. People vanished without a trace. Reports of strange lights in the sky flooded the news. Elias reached the Arctic outpost after days of near-sleepless driving and a chartered cargo plane. The facility was silent, half buried in snow and ice. The wind howled as he stepped inside, sealing the doors behind him. He set to work immediately, using the alien fragment to construct a crude device, an amplifier that could sever the psychic link between him and the creature. But he knew it would come at a cost. The energy required would destroy the entire station, taking him with it. As he connected the final wires, he felt it, the presence. It was here. The temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the walls as the hum became a deafening roar. Elias turned to see the creature stepping out of the shadows, its spines unfurling like wings. "You don't belong here," Elias said hoarsely. The creature tilted its head. Its hollow gaze seemed almost sad. Elias reached for the activation switch. The creature lunged. Pain exploded through his chest as its spines pierced him. Blood seeped into his clothes, but his hand closed around the switch. With a final breath, Elias triggered the device. The station erupted in blinding light. The creature's form twisted and convulsed, its scream reverberating across dimensions as it was pulled apart. Elias felt his body unraveling, torn between two worlds. In the final moments, he glimpsed something, a vast cosmic truth woven into the fabric of existence. The black hole wasn't a place. It was a doorway, and he had left it open. Then everything went dark. The world watched as the Arctic Research Station vanished in a storm of light and fury. Satellites captured a final searing bloom on their infrared scopes, then nothing. The ice field was silent again, an empty grave of snow and ash. For weeks, news outlets speculated. An explosion, a failed experiment, sabotage. No one spoke of the impossible. No one dared to. But those who knew Elias Karn, those who worked with him, who had seen the alien fragment and the quiet terror in his eyes, knew the truth. Something had come to Earth. Months passed. The world turned, oblivious to the invisible wound beneath its surface. But not everyone forgot. Nadia Patel's sister Mira stood at the shoreline of the Arctic Sea, staring out at the broken ice. She had come searching for answers after the vague reports of the research team's disappearance, and after reading Nadia's cryptic final notes. The cold bit into her skin as she watched the waves churn. Mira felt hollow, just as Nadia had described Elias Karn feeling. She clutched the scarf wrapped around her neck, the only thing she had left of her sister. She turned to leave, but froze mid-step. A sound carried across the icy expanse, a low hum, faint at first, then stronger. Her breath caught in her throat as a shadow shifted beneath the fractured ice. A shape, long, sinuous, alien, something moving below. The ice groaned, spiderweb cracks forming under her feet. Mira stumbled back just as a fissure opened, spraying freezing water. She screamed, but no one was near enough to hear. The hum grew louder, then it stopped. The sea went still again. The wind howled, cutting through the silence. Mira stared down into the dark water, her heart hammering in her chest. She saw nothing, but she felt it. She felt him, far below the frozen waters, in a space where time unraveled like thread. Elias drifted. His body had shattered in the explosion, but something deeper, some essence of who he was, remained intact. He floated between dimensions, untethered from his form yet conscious. Memories of his life flickered in the void, laughter at the lab, stargazing with his father as a boy, the first hum of the black hole's song. He felt the pull of the world he had left behind, the distant hum of human life, fragile and fleeting. But beneath that hum was another song, darker and far more ancient. The black hole's truth whispered to him again. You never escaped. Elias had thought the station's destruction would end it, sever the bond between worlds. But he had misunderstood. The creature wasn't an invader. It was a guardian, a messenger from something far larger, something that spanned galaxies, feeding on the mistakes of civilizations that dared reach too far. And now, you are one of us. The realization broke over Elias like a cold tide. His body, if it could still be called that, was no longer human. His veins pulsed with the same alien rhythm as the creature's. His form twisted, stretching into something unrecognizable, bound by the same biological threads of the void world. Yet some small part of him, the last vestige of Elias Karn, the man who once gazed at the stars with wonder, resisted. He thought of the earth, of the people still unaware of the doom slithering beneath their feet. He had failed to close the door, but perhaps he could send a warning before the final breach. But what will they see when they look at you? A monstrous reflection stared back at him, flesh translucent, spines growing from his arms, hollow voids where his eyes had been. A tear formed, not of sadness but something more. Regret, the realization that no one would ever recognize what was left of him. He reached upward towards the distant shimmer of sunlight filtering through the ice. His warped, elongated fingers broke the surface of the water. Mira gasped as a hand, too long, too thin, breached the icy waves. For one brief second, their eyes met. His hollow sockets radiated not hunger, but pain. She staggered back, heart pounding, as she heard the hum in her mind. Run. The word wasn't spoken. It was implanted, branded into her thoughts with terrifying clarity. Mira hesitated, but the water began to churn violently. She turned and ran across the ice, breath ragged as cracks spidered out behind her, the ocean tearing itself open. She didn't look back. She reached the frozen ridge just as the sea erupted in a plume of black, writhing mass. For a single moment she saw his silhouette rising from the depths, a creature of sinew, light, and something human still clinging to its form. Then the ice groaned and the sea swallowed the figure whole. Mira collapsed on the ridge, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what she had seen, only that it wasn't over. Far below, Elias sank back into the void, the last trace of his humanity flickering like a dying star. The hum became a deafening roar, and then silence. In the days that followed, reports trickled in, glimpses of strange lights beneath the Arctic waves, whispers of missing vessels. Mira tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. The world moved on, but those who listened carefully could still hear it, the faint hum beneath the surface of things, a warning or a promise. Elias was gone, but something else was coming, and this time there would be no return. The shuttle Aegis shuddered as it breached Mars' thin atmosphere, its metal frame groaning under the pressure of entry. The orange-red expanse stretched endlessly below, an alien wasteland devoid of movement, save for the faint wisps of dust storms on the horizon. Inside, Commander Elias Grant kept his gaze locked on the distant speck growing larger, the Omega colony. "We're approaching the main settlement," Pilot Ava Cole reported, her voice level despite the unease that hung thick in the cabin. The rest of the rescue team sat in silence, their expressions grim. Grant's eyes flicked to the mission clock. 2 months since the last transmission. 2 months of nothing but eerie silence from a place that had once thrived with over 300 colonists. He could still hear the echo of those final transmissions, the panic, the static-laden screams, the abrupt cut-off. The weight of their absence settled heavily on his shoulders. The colony came into full view, rows of pressurized domes and sleek metal structures interconnected by translucent walkways. Everything looked pristine, unbroken, alive but empty. Cole guided the shuttle to a landing pad, the magnetic clamps engaging with a dull clunk. The engines wound down, and an oppressive silence filled the cabin. "Final systems check. Helms green," Cole muttered. "Welcome to Omega." No one moved at first. Then Grant stood and adjusted the straps of his survival pack. "You know the drill. We keep formation and stay sharp." His tone left no room for questions. He turned to his second in command, Lieutenant Harris. Keep the comms open. No heroics." Harris nodded and shouldered his rifle. The rest of the team followed suit. Dr. Anika Reyes, the xenobiologist, Jiro Nakamura, the former miner, Corporal Vega, the quiet but deadly security specialist, and Malik, the engineer, always armed with tools and a nervous grin. Together they descended the ramp into the colony below. The landing bay was immaculate. Supply crates were stacked neatly. Maintenance tools lay organized on a nearby workbench, untouched by time or crisis. The bay doors loomed ahead, the reinforced glass giving them a full view of the settlement's interior. No movement, no signs of life. Malik frowned, tapping the glass. "I don't get it," he said, voice muffled inside his helmet. "It's like they just left." "Then why leave everything behind?" Reyes muttered, scanning the readouts on her portable bioscanner. "I'm not seeing anything abnormal. No leaks, no atmospheric toxins, nothing." She paused, brow furrowed. "But something feels off." Grant keyed the manual override and the thick doors hissed open. The air inside was cold, dry, too quiet. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly as they stepped into the central plaza. Tables in the common area sat with trays of uneaten food. A child's drawing fluttered to the floor as a weak current from the airlock disturbed it. Grant picked it up, a simple crayon sketch of a smiling family standing under a yellow sun. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary before tucking it into his belt. "Commander," Harris gestured toward the main control hub. "We should access the colony's logs." Grant nodded and they made their way inside. The control room was as pristine as the rest of the colony. Monitors still glowed softly, showing vital signs for an entire community that had simply vanished. Malik began pulling data while Reyes scanned the room with her biosensor. "I don't like this," Reyes whispered, almost to herself. Grant didn't either. The room felt inhabited, even though no one was there. The sense of being watched prickled along his spine. "Here we go," Malik said, his fingers tapping furiously. "Accessing logs." The screen flickered, displaying the latest colony-wide message. A mandatory evacuation alert dated 2 days before the last transmission. But according to the colony's blueprints, the evacuation routes showed nowhere. No transports had launched. "This makes no sense," Harris muttered. "Where did they go?" Malik clicked on another video log. The image was grainy, the timestamp corrupted, but the sound was unmistakable. A man's panicked breathing. The figure on the screen, a tall man in a lab coat, looked frantically behind him before whispering into the recorder. "It started in the tunnels. We dug too far. Something is awake down there." The figure flinched at a distant noise, a low, rhythmic hum that resonated faintly through the speakers. He turned his head sharply, eyes wide with terror. "I can hear them. They whisper when you're alone." The screen cut to static. The hum didn't stop. Reyes' scanner began to beep, faintly at first, then more insistently. She stared at the display. "Do you hear that?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. "Hear what?" Grant asked. "That sound." Her voice was a fragile thread, fraying at the edges. The hum was real now, a low vibration that pulsed through the floor, almost imperceptible. Grant's gaze swept the room. There was nothing there, and yet, a sudden crash. Vega spun, rifle raised. A metal tray lay on the floor, still spinning. "Just the vent," Nakamura said, though his voice was tight. The air ducts groaned overhead, metal expanding and contracting as the colony's climate systems adjusted. "Let's finish this up," Grant ordered, his tone sharp. He knew what was coming. The fear, the paranoia. It was already creeping in. The team moved deeper into the colony, searching for signs of where the people had gone. The residential wing was filled with the debris of everyday life. Clothes strewn across beds, discarded shoes near lockers. Yet there was an emptiness, like the rooms themselves rejected the idea of anyone ever living there. In the mess hall, they found another digital log, a final entry from Dr. Lucille Hahn, the colony's lead xenobiologist. Her recorded face was pale, hollow-eyed. "We shouldn't have gone down there. They don't belong to this world, or to ours." She exhaled, eyes flicking towards something off-screen. "If anyone finds this, don't stay. Don't try to understand. Leave while you still can." The log ended, leaving only the quiet hum of the colony's systems. The silence in the room felt different now, heavier, alive. "Commander," Reyes whispered, barely audible. Her face was pale, sweat beading at her temples. "We're not alone." Grant looked past her, and in the dim light at the end of the hall, something shifted. A shadow moved, unfurled, just before disappearing into the dark. The colony's underground access hatch loomed before them, a sealed door with thick titanium braces. Red emergency lights pulsed in slow, deliberate intervals, casting long, crawling shadows across the walls. The hum from below seemed louder now, rhythmic and unnatural, like the slow beat of something enormous breathing. Grant hesitated before pressing his hand to the door's biometric scanner. It beeped, rejected his print, and flashed an error message. "Colony Administrator access only." "Great. Locked out," Harris muttered, scanning their surroundings. His rifle was raised, his finger brushing the trigger. "I don't like standing here like this." "Malik," Grant said. The engineer was already at work, unscrewing a maintenance panel. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled wires and rerouted circuits. "Give me a minute," Malik mumbled. A gust of air hissed from the ventilation shaft overhead. The team tensed. "Relax," Nakamura said, though his eyes were pinned to the shadows. "Pressure shift." "Sure," Vega replied. Her rifle remained steady, pointed toward the corner where the air had moved. Malik cursed under his breath as sparks flew from the panel. "Almost there!" With a loud clank, the door's lock disengaged. The hatch slid open, revealing a steep, industrial staircase descending into darkness. A sharp metallic smell wafted up from below, wet like rust and something else. Grant clicked on his shoulder light, the beam cutting through the gloom. The others followed, their lights flickering down the length of the staircase. "Keep formation. No one wanders off," Grant ordered. He didn't need to explain why. Everyone already knew. The descent felt endless. Each footstep echoed down the stairwell, distorted and strange, like the sound was being pulled apart. Halfway down, Reyes froze. "Did you hear that?" Grant turned. "Hear what?" She tilted her head, her face pale and tense. A voice, a woman's voice. The others exchanged wary glances. "Nothing but creaking metal," Nakamura muttered. "No." Rhea's voice hardened. "It said my name." She pointed her scanner toward the far side of the stairwell, where the shadows were thickest. The device emitted a low, confused beep. That shouldn't happen. There's no biological signature. "Stay focused," Grant said, though the hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end. He motioned them to keep moving. They reached the bottom of the stairwell, where a wide maintenance tunnel stretched out before them. The walls were damp, almost organic-looking. Their lights reflected faintly off thin, pulsing veins of mineral deposits running through the rock. "What the hell?" Harris whispered. He ran a hand over the surface. This wasn't here in the original structure plans. "Drilling must have exposed a pocket in the crust," Reyes said, though her voice was hollow. "But this doesn't look natural." Grant motioned for silence. The hum was louder down here, resonating from deeper within the tunnel. A soft glow emanated from somewhere far ahead, a sickly bioluminescent light. They followed the tunnel in tense silence, every step feeling like a violation. A cold, crawling sensation slid across their skin, like they'd stepped into a place that had never known life. The tunnel opened into a massive cavern, the ceiling arched high above, riddled with strange, root-like tendrils that pulsed faintly, like arteries. At the center of the cavern stood an array of strange, ribbed structures rising from the ground like bone towers. The glow pulsed from their cores, bathing the chamber in dim, shifting light. Reyes moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. "It's growing." She pointed to the largest structure where a hardened shell-like surface pulsed in slow, steady beats. "This isn't just rock. This is biological." Nakamura swore under his breath. "You're telling me they dug into a living... what? Organism?" Reyes crouched, running her gloved hand across the surface of a nearby tendril. She pulled back when the vein twitched beneath her touch. "I think they woke something up." A sudden burst of static crackled in their headsets, followed by a low whisper that cut in and out like a broken signal. "Why are you here?" Grant stiffened. "Malik, run a diagnostic on comms." Malik didn't respond. He was standing rigid, his eyes locked on something at the far end of the cavern. "Malik," Grant said again, stepping toward him. Malik's head snapped toward Grant, his face pale, his pupils wide and glassy. "There's someone standing over there," he whispered. The team turned their lights toward the far end of the cavern. Nothing, just empty shadows. "There was someone there," Malik insisted, voice rising. She was standing right there." "I swear we need to move," Grant said, forcing calm into his voice. "Now." The team began to back away, but the hum rose, vibrating through the walls. The cavern seemed to shift, flesh and stone blurring together. Then the light pulsed, and the shadows moved. Something skittered along the walls, too fast to see. A low clicking sound echoed through the chamber. "Contact!" Harris shouted, raising his rifle. The shape darted into view, a pale, elongated form with segmented limbs and a slick, translucent hide. It clung to the wall for a heartbeat, its eyeless head swiveling toward the team. Harris fired, the shot lighting up the cavern in a blinding flash. The creature dropped from the wall and slithered back into the darkness with an inhuman screech. Reyes screamed. Another form shot out from the shadows behind her, a mass of twisted limbs and ridged bone. It grabbed her shoulder, its appendages splitting open into thin, writhing filaments that dug into her suit. "Get it off her!" Grant yelled, rushing forward. Nakamura swung his mining blade, severing the filaments with a sickening squelch. The creature let out a high-pitched keening as it writhed and skittered backward into the dark. Reyes fell to the ground, clutching her shoulder. Her suit was torn and pale, web-like threads writhed beneath her skin. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes unfocused. "We're leaving," Grant barked, hauling her to her feet. They sprinted back through the tunnel, the hum rising into a deafening roar. The cavern shuddered, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. The skittering sounds multiplied behind them. Grant could feel something closing in. Many things. They burst into the stairwell, slamming the hatch behind them. Vega sealed it shut with shaking hands, her eyes wild. For a moment there was silence, just their ragged breaths and the distant hum. Then Reyes whispered, her voice weak but clear, "They're inside me." The team stared at her in horror. Her veins had begun to pulse faintly, glowing in time with the hum. The hatch rattled as something slammed against it from below. The steel groaned but held, the sound reverberating up the stairwell. The team stood in a tight circle, their lights casting harsh beams into the surrounding gloom. Reyes was on her knees, cradling her shoulder as her breathing turned shallow and erratic. The faint glow beneath her skin pulsed stronger now, spreading in thin branching lines from the wound. "She's infected," Malik said, barely a whisper. "No," Reyes gasped, shaking her head. "I'm fine." But her voice was weak and her pupils were dilated. She clutched at Grant's arm, fingers trembling. "Don't leave me." Grant's jaw tightened. He crouched beside her, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "We're not leaving anyone behind," he said, but they both knew it was a lie. Behind him, Harris took a step back, his rifle still trained on the hatch. "Commanders, we have to face facts. If we wait too long..." "We're not killing her," Grant snapped, the words sharper than he intended. Harris's eyes flicked to the glowing tendrils beneath Reyes's skin. "We might not have a choice." Before Grant could respond, a soft clicking sound echoed through the corridor, deliberate, predatory. The team went silent, their lights darting toward the shadows at the end of the hall. The clicking grew louder, spreading until it surrounded them. "They're moving above us," Nakamura said, his voice low, as if speaking too loud would draw them closer. "In the vents." The metal grates overhead groaned. Grant grabbed Reyes, hauling her to her feet. "Move! Now!" The team broke into a run, sprinting down the corridor toward the colony's main power station. The passage stretched ahead like an endless throat, dim emergency lights flickering at irregular intervals. The air felt heavier with every step, like something unseen was pressing down on them. Behind them, the clicking intensified, accompanied by the scrape of claws on metal. Vega was the first to turn and fire. Her rifle roared, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the passage. The shadowed shapes at the edge of the light shrank back, hissing. "They're hurting us," she said, breathing hard. "Keep moving," Grant barked. They rounded a corner and burst into the power station, a vast room lined with humming generators and maintenance consoles. The hum of the colony's systems was deafening here, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the walls. Grant slammed the bulkhead shut behind them, locking it with a manual override. "This will hold," he said, though he wasn't sure. Malik ran to the central console and pulled up the schematics. "We can overload the core," he said, fingers flying over the keys. "If we push the reactor into meltdown, it'll take out the entire colony and the tunnels." "And us," Harris added grimly. Malik nodded. "Yeah, unless we get to the shuttle in time." Reyes stumbled to the ground, clutching her stomach. Her skin was turning pale, veins bulging beneath the surface. She let out a soft, choked cry as her fingers spasmed. The glow was spreading faster now, creeping toward her neck. "It's changing me," she whispered. Her gaze locked onto Grant's. "Please, don't let it take me." Grant's throat tightened. "You'll make it," he said, forcing the words out. Reyes's eyes glistened with fear, but there was something else there too. Resignation. "No, I won't." She reached into her belt and pulled out a small, worn locket, the only personal item she'd brought from Earth. She pressed it into Grant's hand. "For my sister," she said softly. Grant closed his hand around the locket. "I'm sorry." Reyes smiled faintly, tears slipping down her face. "I'm already gone." Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed Harris's rifle and pressed the barrel under her chin. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space. Reyes's body crumpled to the floor. The team froze, horror etched across their faces. Blood pooled beneath Reyes, but the glow beneath her skin slowly faded like a dying ember. "We need to go," Malik whispered, his voice barely steady. Grant forced himself to his feet. His hand was shaking as he wiped blood off the locket and slipped it into his pocket. "Set the core to overload," he said. Malik nodded, tears in his eyes as he keyed in the sequence. The reactor's status lights began to flash red, and a loud warning siren blared through the station. A deep, bone-rattling rumble shook the room as the core began its meltdown sequence. "Time to evac," Grant said. The team sprinted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the power station. The passage beyond led directly to the surface and the landing pad where the shuttle awaited. But as they reached the door, it exploded inward. A massive form surged through the wreckage, a creature unlike the others. It stood taller than a man, its elongated limbs slick with translucent, bone-like plating. Its chest pulsed with a sickly light, and its eyeless head twitched toward them, sensing heat or movement. "Back!" Harris shouted, opening fire. The creature moved with terrifying speed, lunging toward Harris. Its arms split apart into thin, spiked appendages that impaled him through the chest. Harris coughed blood, eyes wide as the creature lifted him effortlessly. Grant fired into the creature's side, his bullets tearing through its pale hide. It let out a guttural screech and tossed Harris's lifeless body aside. Nakamura rushed forward with his mining blade, swinging with all his strength. The blade sunk into the creature's torso, but it barely flinched. It grabbed Nakamura by the throat, its claws tightening. "Get out!" Nakamura choked. He jammed a detonation charge into the creature's ribcage and locked eyes with Grant. "Go!" The blast ripped through the creature, spraying viscera and shrapnel. Nakamura's body was thrown against the wall, his motionless form slumping to the ground. Grant and the others stumbled through the wreckage, deafened by the explosion. Only he and Malik remained. They sprinted down the final passage as the colony's structure groaned and buckled. The shuttle's ramp was still open, its engines humming. Malik glanced back at the collapsing settlement and hesitated. "You first," Grant urged. Malik nodded and climbed aboard, but as he reached the top of the ramp, something grabbed his leg, a thin, pale arm reaching out from beneath the ramp. "Malik!" Grant rushed forward, grabbing his arm. Malik screamed, thrashing as the creature's tendrils coiled around him, dragging him down. "Cut it loose," Malik yelled, panic in his eyes. Grant hesitated, then activated the ramp controls. The doors slammed shut with a hiss, severing the creature's limb. Malik collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating. The engines roared as the shuttle ascended, flames bursting beneath the ship as the colony below erupted in a massive explosion. The shockwave rattled the shuttle as they broke through the upper atmosphere, the ruined colony a distant, burning scar on the surface of Mars. In the silence that followed, Grant looked down at his hands, still stained with blood, and felt something cold shift beneath his skin. The faint, rhythmic hum was still there, and it was inside him. The shuttle's cockpit was bathed in pale artificial light. Outside, the crimson expanse of Mars grew smaller, retreating into the void. Commander Grant sat in the pilot's chair, shoulders slumped, his fingers gripping the controls with a white-knuckled force. The hum of the engines was steady, but beneath that familiar mechanical hum, he could still hear it. A faint pulse inside his own chest, like a second heartbeat. Behind him, Malik sat silently in the co-pilot's seat, staring straight ahead. His leg was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, blood still seeping through the fabric. His breathing was slow, shallow. Neither of them had spoken since the shuttle broke through the upper atmosphere. The silence was heavy, like a tomb. Grant reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket Reyes had given him. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the faint warmth of the metal. The sight of it made his chest tighten. For a brief moment he could still see her face, tear-streaked, determined, and terrified. Malik shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot up his leg. He finally broke the silence. Did we do it?" His voice was hoarse. Grant nodded. "Yeah. The colony's gone. Nothing left." He wished the words felt like a victory, but they didn't. Malik closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Good. It had to end there. The console beeped softly, an incoming proximity warning. They were nearing the orbital communications range. In just a few minutes, they would re-establish contact with Earth. They would have to explain what happened. "Grant," Malik whispered, eyes still closed. "What if it's not over?" Grant's gaze shifted to the viewport. The stars blurred slightly, his vision swimming. He clenched his fists, trying to drown out the sensation crawling beneath his skin. It felt like something foreign was coiled within him, spreading in slow, deliberate pulses. "It's over," Grant lied. Malik didn't respond. The console chimed again, a priority alert. Grant hesitated before opening the channel. The static cleared, replaced by a familiar voice. "This is Mission Control. Aegis, do you copy?" The voice was calm, reassuring, like home. Grant swallowed hard, leaning into the microphone. "This is Aegis. We copy." There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of relieved chatter in the background. "We lost you for a while, Aegis. What's your status?" Grant's mind raced. What could he say? What could anyone say after what they'd seen? After what had happened to Reyes? Harris? Nakamura? The words caught in his throat. Malik's eyes opened slightly, unfocused. His skin was pale and beads of sweat rolled down his temples. "Tell them we didn't make it," he rasped. Grant turned toward him, stunned. "What?" Malik's gaze sharpened for a moment, and in that instant, Grant saw the truth. Malik wasn't talking about their survival. He was talking about the infection, about the hum they could both feel now, beating inside their veins like a death knell. "You know what's happening," Malik continued, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes filled with a quiet, resigned horror. "It's inside us." Grant felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't true, but he could already feel the faint, crawling warmth spreading through his bloodstream. He thought of the creatures back in the tunnels, their twisted, sinewy forms, their eyeless faces, their awful hunger. He thought of Reyes pleading with him before she was overtaken. Mission Control's voice crackled through the speaker again. "Aegis, what happened to the colony? Is it secure?" Grant's hands hovered over the console. He could end the transmission. Shut it off. But then what? They couldn't return to Earth. Not like this. Not carrying what they'd found. Malik's hand twitched as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small, dull object, one of the emergency flares from his utility belt. His fingers fumbled weakly as he turned it over, checking the primer. Grant's heart sank. "Don't." Malik gave him a weak smile. "We don't have a choice." Before Grant could react, Malik twisted the flare and pressed it against the fuel line beneath the console. The flare ignited with a whoosh, sending up a blinding plume of heat and light. The fire spread instantly, racing along the pipes and panels. Warning sirens blared as the shuttle systems went haywire. The cockpit filled with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal. Flames curled across the walls, licking at the seats. The oxygen alarms shrieked as pressure levels plummeted. Grant lurched forward, grabbing Malik by the shoulders. "We can stop this." Malik's eyes locked with his. We can't." The heat seared Grant's skin as the fire consumed the consoles. The shuttle shuddered violently, its structural integrity failing. Malik's body slumped as the smoke overtook him. Grant coughed, his vision blurring. He thought about the crew, Reyes, Harris, Nakamura. He thought about the colony, the families, the children. He thought about Earth, untouched and innocent, completely unaware of the horror that could have spread like wildfire across the stars. The warning lights flared red. The fuel line ruptured with a deafening explosion, and the cockpit was engulfed in flames. As the firestorm tore through the shuttle, Grant felt a strange, unexpected peace settle over him. The hum inside his chest faded. The second heartbeat, the alien pulse, it was gone. The stars outside the viewport blurred, then vanished completely in a searing burst of white light. Far below, Mars lay silent once more, the colony's remains buried beneath layers of dust and ruin. The only trace of what had happened was a distant, fading streak of fire as the shuttle disintegrated in orbit. The silence lingered. Nothing stirred. Nothing answered. For now, the ISS Aegis broke through the swirling expanse of Saturn's magnetosphere, its reinforced hull thrumming under the pressure of alien radiation. Outside the observation deck, the rings spread out like a celestial ocean of shattered glass, glinting gold and silver in the faint light of the distant sun. Captain Elias Rourke stood with his arms crossed, staring into the endless spiral of debris. His reflection in the reinforced glass looked gaunt, worn down by the journey. This was the closest any manned mission had ever come to the rings, and there was a reverence to it, a strange, terrifying beauty. Behind him, the soft hum of footsteps echoed. Dr. Mara Voss approached, tablet in hand, eyes wide with quiet wonder. "Can you believe it?" she whispered, as though afraid her voice might disturb the silent behemoth outside. "We're the first." Rourke nodded but kept his jaw tight. "Closest anyone's ever been. Let's hope we make it back just as easily." The ship's systems buzzed with low-frequency noise, harmless interference according to Lian Cho, the navigator. Rourke didn't share her certainty. The further they ventured into the orbit, the stranger the signals became, like ghostly waves of static brushing against their sensors. Cho had dismissed it as electromagnetic scatter from the planet's massive radiation belts, but something about the patterns made his skin prickle. "We're getting anomalous readings from the debris clusters," Cho said from her console. She tapped the screen where faint, irregular pulses of light flared between jagged rocks of ice and dust. "Looks like reflective interference, maybe from the ship's headlights." "Turn them off," Rourke ordered. The forward floodlights dimmed. The deck plunged into shadow with only the soft glow of instrument panels illuminating the room. Yet the strange lights outside remained, ethereal strands that pulsed with a rhythm too organic to be a mere trick of physics. Voss leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. "It's moving." The faint, shimmering strands of light shifted, coiling through the debris field like slow-moving tendrils of phosphorescent seaweed. The lights undulated, drawing closer to the ship as though sensing its presence. "It's alive," Voss muttered, almost to herself. Rourke's brow furrowed. "You don't know that?" "No, I don't," she admitted. Her eyes didn't leave the lights. "But I can feel it." The ship drifted deeper into the orbit, and the glow of the rings thickened. From the engineering bay, Holt Grayson's voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, I'm getting some weird feedback in the engines. Nothing critical, but it's like something's out there, bouncing signals back at us." Rourke pressed the intercom. "You're sure it's not interference from the debris?" A pause. Then, "I don't think so, sir." It's almost like an echo. The lights outside grew brighter as they drew closer to the densest part of the ring structure, vast and impenetrable. A cold weight settled in Rourke's gut. It wasn't the lights themselves, it was the way they behaved. They weren't random bursts of cosmic energy or refracted reflections. They shifted with purpose, flickering and swirling in strange, deliberate patterns. "Cho, plot a temporary drift route. I want us skimming the outskirts until we can recalibrate the readings," Rourke said. Cho hesitated. "Captain, if we pull back now, we'll lose visibility in the active scan zone. The board wants samples from the core ring." "I don't care what the board wants," Rourke snapped. "We pull back. Now." Cho swallowed her retort and keyed in the adjustment. The ship's thrusters pulsed, guiding them along the perimeter of the debris field. Voss exhaled sharply, breaking the tension. "Sorry, She hesitated, eyes flicking between the shimmering display and the captain. I've never seen anything like this. If it's biological, we're looking at something unprecedented." "We're not confirming anything yet," Rourke said, but his voice lacked conviction. A sudden metallic groan echoed through the ship as the aft stabilizer adjusted to the drift. The noise made everyone flinch. It was an ordinary sound, one they'd heard countless times during testing. But out here, so close to something unknown, it felt unnervingly wrong. "Run a systems check," Rourke said, his voice low. "Top to bottom." Grayson's voice came through again, this time tense. Captain, you're gonna want to see this." Rourke and Voss exchanged a look, then headed toward the engineering bay. The air felt thicker now, heavier with every step. When they reached Grayson's station, the engineer pointed to the diagnostic screen. "I've been monitoring the external scans," Grayson said, his eyes wide beneath his visor. "The lights, they're not just glowing. They're emitting pulses, waves of energy, maybe sound. And get this, they're syncing with the ship's comm frequency." Voss leaned in. "Resonance patterns?" Grayson nodded grimly. "If I didn't know better, I'd say they're trying to communicate." A long, strained silence filled the room. Rourke rubbed the back of his neck, trying to force down the growing sense of dread. "Or," he said, "they're trying to lure us in." A flicker of panic flashed in Grayson's eyes. "So, what do we do?" Before Rourke could answer, the ship lurched, an unexpected tremor that sent loose tools clattering to the floor. Voss gripped the console to steady herself. "What the hell was that?" Grayson shouted, typing furiously at the keyboard. Cho's voice cut through the comm. "Captain, the lights. They've surrounded us." Rourke rushed back to the observation deck, heart pounding. Outside, the entire expanse of the rings had transformed. The distant, scattered glimmers of light were now everywhere, like a field of stars swirling through the debris, closing in on the Aegis. The strands coiled together, creating intricate shapes that pulsed in unison, brighter and faster. For the first time, Rourke felt it too, an oppressive presence pressing against the walls of the ship. The lights weren't just observing, they were aware, and they were closing in. The ISS Aegis floated in tense silence as the strange lights drifted closer. They flickered through the debris field like glowing streamers, winding around fragments of ice and rock. In the dim light of the control room, Captain Rourke watched with clenched fists as the shapes outside danced in synchrony, their shifting forms resembling something alive. Not a single voice broke the silence until Mara Voss stepped forward, her breath shallow. "They're signaling us," she whispered. Rourke shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Or hunting us." A soft chime from the console broke the spell. Cho's hands darted across the panel. "Captain, I'm reading a mass ahead. Large. It's moving slowly, just past the second debris cluster." She brought up the live feed. The screen filled with a hazy silhouette, an enormous, jagged structure embedded in the ring's path. Shards of crystalline ice jutted from it like spines, refracting starlight in scattered bursts. But beneath the ice there was something else, a darker core, almost organic in appearance. The way it twisted and bulged looked too deliberate to be random space debris. "It's not a rock," Voss murmured. "That's something else." The room seemed to grow colder. Holt Grayson leaned over her shoulder, brow furrowed. "Could be a fragment from a comet, or maybe the core of a collapsed moon." "No moon looks like that," Voss muttered. She tapped a section of the scan that showed faint traces of carbon structures, complex web-like patterns embedded in the dark mass. It's biological." Rourke straightened, fists tightening. "Suit up." The preparation for EVA felt automatic, training routines honed through years of missions. Yet this time the familiar motions felt heavier, as if the ship itself resisted. Voss, Grayson, and Hassan Idris stood in front of the airlock as the final pressure checks completed. The rest of the crew watched from the observation deck, their faces pale. "You're sure about this?" Cho's voice crackled over the comm. "That structure could be unstable. Hell, it could be anything." "We need answers," Rourke said firmly. He met Voss's gaze through her helmet's visor. "You get in, take your scans, and get out. If anything seems off—" "I know," she interrupted. "I'll pull out." But Rourke saw the glint of curiosity in her eyes, the same obsession that had driven her research for years. The outer hatch opened, revealing the vast emptiness of space. The three astronauts drifted out, tethered by thin cables that seemed laughably fragile against the backdrop of Saturn's vast horizon. Their suit lights illuminated jagged fragments of ice and rock as they approached the structure. Voss reached it first. The dark mass was even more alien up close. It was shaped like a twisted spine, its surface covered in calcified ridges that branched out like veins frozen in black stone. She placed a gloved hand against it. The material was rough, but slightly pliable, almost like cartilage. "Look at this," she said, scanning the structure. "There's a rhythmic pulse running through the whole thing." She paused. "It's faint, but I think it's alive." Grayson floated beside her, his visor tilted toward the strange growths spiraling outward from the core. "Jesus!" He raised a handheld spectrometer and frowned. "There's no way this formed naturally." Idris's voice came through with forced calm. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Collect the samples and get out." Voss nodded and activated her core drill. The machine whirred as the bit bit into the outer layer, sending small fragments of blackened material into the vacuum. But as the drill pressed deeper, something moved beneath the surface. Voss froze. "Did you see that?" Grayson hesitated. "See what?" Before she could answer, a thin, luminous tendril uncoiled from within the crack. It shimmered with the same pale light as the orbs outside. The tendril writhed slowly in zero gravity, then shot forward, piercing Voss's left forearm like a spear. Her scream echoed through the comms. The tendril withdrew in an instant, leaving her suit punctured and her arm limp. Blood and oxygen sprayed briefly in a silver mist before the suit's self-seal activated. "Voss!" Idris lunged toward her, grabbing her harness and pulling her back. Her body spasmed as she clutched her arm, gasping. "Get her back to the ship!" Grayson slammed his hand on his comms. "Captain, she's hit! Something stabbed her!" Rourke's voice was calm but cold. "Bring her in, now!" The team reeled Voss back toward the airlock as she groaned, her breathing shallow. The lights outside seemed to ripple in response, growing brighter, swarming in intricate patterns around the structure. Grayson cast a glance back and felt the hairs on his neck rise. "They're following us," he muttered. Inside the ship, chaos erupted. Idris and Cho secured Voss in the medical bay as Rourke watched from the threshold. Her arm was pale and swollen beneath the torn suit, veins spreading in unnatural tendrils beneath her skin. Idris cut away the material to examine the wound. "Is it venom?" Rourke asked. Idris shook his head, his brow furrowed. "No. No puncture like a sting or bite. It didn't injure anything. He trailed off, staring at the glowing blue-black veins twisting up her arm. "It changed her." Voss's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain. Her lips moved, but her voice was barely audible. "It wasn't trying to hurt me." "Don't talk," Idris said firmly, administering a sedative. "It spoke," she murmured before the drug took effect. Her head lolled to the side and her breathing slowed. Rourke stepped closer, his face grim. "What do you mean, spoke?" Idris shot him a sharp glance. "She's delirious, blood loss and shock." But Rourke wasn't so sure. He stared at the faint, pulsing glow beneath her skin, the same cold alien light that had surrounded the ship. Grayson entered the room, his face pale. "Captain, you need to see this." Rourke followed him back to the observation deck. On the screen, the alien structure was still visible, but now it was shifting, curling inward like some colossal, slumbering creature, slowly stirring awake. The lights encircling the debris pulsed faster, brighter. Cho's voice cracked over the speakers. "They're accelerating!" The team fell silent as the realization sank in. The lights weren't scattered anomalies or random phenomena. They were connected to the structure, extensions of it, alive and aware. And somehow, by touching it, Voss had woken something. The sterile hum of the ISS Aegis's medical bay was drowned out by Voss's ragged breathing. Her face was pale, beads of sweat running down her temples as Idris hovered over her, adjusting the monitors. The glowing tendrils beneath her skin twisted and pulsed, branching further up her arm and spreading toward her collarbone. Each throb sent a faint pulse of bioluminescent light through her veins. Blue, almost serene, but utterly wrong. Captain Rourke stood near the door, fists clenched. "How bad is it?" Idris exhaled slowly, not meeting his gaze. "I don't even know what I'm looking at. It's spreading too fast. Her immune system isn't fighting it. It's adapting to it." Rourke felt the weight of the air around him, suffocating. "Can you amputate the arm?" Grayson flinched. "You can't be serious." Idris gave a slow shake of his head. "It's too late. Whatever this is, it's not localized anymore." He pointed to the branching veins now webbing across her chest. The skin looked stretched and glassy, as though something beneath was shifting, reforming. Voss groaned, her body writhing. Her eyes fluttered open, pupils blown wide. When she spoke, her voice was low, distant. "They're calling. I can hear them." Rourke moved closer. "Voss, stay with me. Who's calling?" Her eyes locked on his, but they weren't the eyes of the brilliant scientist he'd known. They were distant, alien. She whispered, "The lights. They're not lights. They're pieces, fragments of something whole." Her back arched violently, and a sickening crack echoed through the room. Idris grabbed her shoulders, trying to hold her down, but her body convulsed with impossible strength. "Sedate her again," Rourke barked. Idris jabbed the syringe into her thigh. Voss's body sagged, her breath slowing, but the glow beneath her skin only grew brighter. The lights formed intricate patterns, spiraling in fractal shapes, shifting with every breath she took. Grayson's voice was hoarse. "Captain, it's like she's becoming one of them." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 2 hours later, the lights outside the ship had thickened, clustering tighter around the debris field. Cho had shut down all non-essential systems, hoping to reduce the ship's emissions, but the swarm showed no signs of dissipating. They drifted through space like luminous predators, circling their prey. Rourke entered the control room, exhaustion weighing him down. "Status?" Cho's fingers tapped nervously on the console. "We're holding orbit, but something's jamming our short-range comms. It's them. Whatever they are, they're interfering with everything." Rourke glanced at the main monitor, where the jagged mass from the rings loomed like a monolith. It hadn't moved, but the glowing tendrils pulsing around it had grown thicker. The fragments of debris clinging to it began to look disturbingly skeletal, organic shapes wrapped in ice and stone. A soft beeping caught his attention. Grayson's voice came over the comms. "Captain, you need to come back to the medical bay." When Rourke arrived, the first thing he noticed was the smell, something metallic, almost like ozone after a storm. Voss lay on the table, motionless, but wrong. The skin of her left arm had split along the veins, revealing something beneath that shimmered like wet cartilage. The bone was visible in places, but it had twisted, reshaping into thin branching protrusions that resembled coral. Her fingers had elongated, tapering into sharp, jointless points. Idris stepped back, eyes hollow. "She's changing." Voss's chest rose slowly. Her ribs seemed to shift unnaturally beneath her skin. "She should be dead," Idris whispered. "Her vitals, they're holding steady, but they're not human anymore." Rourke felt a cold wave of nausea. "Is she conscious?" "Barely." Idris ran a scanner over her. "She's fighting, But whatever this thing is, it's overriding her system. It's rebuilding her from the inside out. A rasping sound filled the room. Voss's voice. Her lips barely moved, but the words were clear. It's not pain, it's clarity. Rourke stepped closer. Voss, you have to fight this. Her head turned slowly, her neck cracking as if her joints had stiffened. Her mouth twisted into a grim parody of a smile. You don't understand. I see them. I am them. The room seemed to tilt. Idris reached for the sedative gun again, but Voss's body jerked upright before he could inject it. The restraints on her arms and legs snapped with a sickening snap. She moved faster than any human should have been able to, seizing Idris by the wrist. Her fingers dug into his arm and he let out a scream. Grayson grabbed a wrench from the nearby tray and swung it hard against her back. Voss barely flinched. Her head twisted toward him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, her eyes glowed with the same light as the tendrils outside. She threw Idris aside like a rag doll. Rourke drew his sidearm. Mara, don't make me... Her distorted voice interrupted him. You still think this is about survival? Her body writhed as more cracks split open along her skin, revealing plates of translucent, chitinous growth. This is evolution. We were blind before, but now I see everything. She took a step forward. Rourke pulled the trigger. The first shot struck her in the chest, but she barely faltered. The second hit her shoulder, tearing through the strange membrane beneath her skin. Bioluminescent fluid leaked from the wound, glowing as it splattered across the floor. Voss staggered but didn't fall. Her body shuddered as if every muscle were locking into place. Her head tilted, and for the first time there was a flicker of something familiar in her eyes. Something fragile. Kill me, she whispered. Rourke hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. She lunged forward, her hands reaching out. Not in violence, but as if she wanted to grasp something that wasn't there. She collapsed before she could reach him, her twisted body convulsing once more before falling still. The silence that followed was unbearable. Idris pushed himself up from the floor, clutching his bleeding arm. Grayson stared at Voss's body, wrench still in hand. Cho's voice came over the intercom, shaky and breathless. Captain, the lights outside, they're reacting. Rourke's gaze moved to the observation window. Outside, the field of glowing strands pulsed in unison, faster and faster. The ship's hull groaned under the mounting pressure. They're not just reacting, Rourke muttered. They know. And somewhere deep in the ring, the massive structure began to move. The ISS Aegis trembled under the weight of something vast and ancient. The ship's internal alarms blared, their shrill cries mixing with the frantic shouts of the crew. Lights flickered across the deck, bathing the room in bursts of red. Captain Rourke braced himself against the console as another deep groan rippled through the ship's frame, a sound like the slow splitting of bone. Outside the observation window, the alien mass writhed, its chitinous tendrils unfolding like the arms of some monstrous leviathan. The glowing filaments weaved together, forming great arcs of light that pulsed in rhythm, faster and faster, like a heart preparing to burst. The thing was awake now. Cho's voice broke through the chaos, panicked but steady. Captain, the hull integrity is down to 42%. If we don't... A deafening bang cut her off as a section of the lower deck ruptured, sending a plume of debris spiraling into space. The ship jolted violently, throwing Rourke to the floor. Sparks rained down from a blown-out circuit. Somewhere, a pressure valve hissed, spilling oxygen into the vacuum. "Seal the breach," Rourke shouted, his voice hoarse. Grayson's hands flew across the control panel, rerouting emergency power, venting lower compartments. His eyes flicked up to meet Rourke's. "It's not enough. That thing, it's tearing us apart." Rourke shoved himself upright, fighting the dizzying spin in his head. "What about the self-destruct? Is it still online?" Cho hesitated for a moment too long. Then she nodded. "Yeah, but if we trigger it, we'll have 10 minutes. Max. Then we're out of time." The airlock doors hissed open as Rourke sprinted toward the main reactor bay, Grayson at his heels. Idris was already there, clutching his injured arm as he worked furiously to reroute the final failsafe controls. Sweat dripped from his face, mixing with the blood staining his sleeve. "Are you sure this will work?" Idris muttered, his fingers trembling as he connected the last bypass. Rourke didn't answer. He glanced toward the small viewport at the edge of the reactor bay. Through the thick glass, he could see the swirling lights converging, wrapping tighter around the Aegis like constricting serpents. They weren't just attacking, they were assimilating. The outer hull was warping, the metallic plating softening and darkening as the alien substance spread. "It has to work," Rourke finally said. Grayson nodded grimly and keyed in the final sequence. "Self-destruct is primed. Countdown starts as soon as you give the order." Rourke hesitated, his hand hovering over the console. In his mind, he could still see his face, the flash of terror, the moment she begged him to end it. She had been the first, but she wouldn't be the last if this thing ever reached Earth. He pressed the button. A mechanical voice filled the air. "Self-destruct sequence initiated. Detonation in 10 minutes." The words felt like a death knell. Grayson exhaled sharply. "That's it then." Idris stumbled toward the comms station, his breath labored. "We still need to send the beacon." In the control room, Cho was frantically typing as the walls around her groaned under the pressure. Come on," she whispered, trying to get the emergency beacon online. The ship was breaking apart piece by piece. Bulkheads twisted inward, leaking coolant and smoke. Sparks danced like fireflies in the dim, broken lights. At last, a green signal flashed on the screen. The beacon was ready. Cho slammed the activation key. "Beacon launched," she called out over the comm. "The message is on its way." She leaned back, relief flooding her for a brief second, until she saw the tendrils snaking along the outside of the ship. They slithered toward the thrusters, wrapping around the engines like vines. Cho's heart stopped. "Captain, the engines!" Rourke's voice came through the comms, grim and resolute. "We're not making it out, Cho." In the final moments, the crew gathered in the central chamber. The ship groaned around them, the alien growth encroaching through the seams of the walls, pulsing with faint, sickly light. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air felt thick with an unnatural weight. Grayson, his face pale, gripped the railing beside him. "If someone ever finds that beacon, do you think they'll listen?" "They have to," Idris muttered. Cho closed her eyes briefly, her voice soft. "At least we sent a warning. At least someone will know." Rourke stood at the center, the countdown echoing in his ears. 2 minutes remaining. He looked at each of them in turn, his crew, his family, the people who had trusted him to lead them through the darkest void. He felt the weight of his failure, but he also felt something else. Pride. "You've done everything you could," he said quietly. "I couldn't have asked for a better team." The floor beneath them trembled as another explosion ripped through the lower decks. A spray of sparks illuminated the room, casting brief, flickering shadows. Cho smiled faintly through her tears. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" She gestured toward the observation window, where the rings of Saturn shimmered in the distance, golden and eternal. Even now, as the alien tendrils writhed and closed in, there was something achingly beautiful about the sight. Rourke took a slow, steady breath. "Yeah," he whispered. "It is." Detonation in 30 seconds. The ship's final seconds dragged out, heavy and surreal. The Aegis felt like a heartbeat away from death, the weight of infinity pressing in from every side. Grayson closed his eyes. Idris whispered a prayer under his breath. Cho placed her hand against the glass, staring into the endless void beyond. Rourke stood tall, unflinching. His mind was calm now. The fear was gone. Whatever came next, this would be the end, but it would also be their victory. The countdown hit 0. A blinding light erupted from the Aegis, expanding outward in a brilliant, searing wave. The detonation tore through the alien structure, shredding the debris field into fragments. The glow of the filaments burned away in the explosion, their pulsing forms snuffed out in an instant. The ship and its nightmare cargo were gone, atomized in a final, defiant blaze of destruction. The rings of Saturn shimmered in silence once more, undisturbed by the death of the ship that had dared to drift too close. Far beyond the distant pull of the planet's gravity, the emergency beacon sailed through the void, small, fragile, but carrying a warning etched in its fragile signal. "Do not approach the rings." The stars blinked in cold indifference as the message drifted outward, lost in the endless dark. And somewhere in the stillness of the rings, a faint pulse flickered, then faded into nothingness. The silence was absolute, and Saturn waited.